Shields up, with Warlords in this Atari archive. It's no secret by this point in the VCS's lifetime that most of the games on the platform are ports of arcade titles. This wasn't an unusual arrangement. Coin-op games were in the middle of a boom period, and translating those experiences to weaker home hardware had been a go-to for Atari going back to 1975's home Pong. Today's game, Warlords, may potentially be one of the few games that goes the other way, or possibly, it was co-developed alongside its big brother. For while there is an arcade version of Warlords, according to its developer, it's the VCS version that was the original. As an aside, Warlords has an unusual bit of program code that causes the picture sync to act strangely on an upscaler. There is a fixed ROM that I captured footage from, but I'll be interspersing video of the original just because that was the one I used while the COVID pandemic had cooled enough that I was able to get multiplayer footage. So, apologies for the video jitters, there's nothing wrong with your browser. Warlords comes to us from Carla Meninsky, last seen in this series with her debut game, Dodge 'em, though the original concept predates her work on it. The origins lie with an Atari creative designer named Roger Hector. In an interview shared with me by historian Alex Smith, Hector explained that when he joined Atari in 1976, the mantra was that a good idea for a game could come from anywhere, and so basically anyone on staff could, and would, pitch ideas, with senior management deciding which would move ahead. Hector himself started off in industrial design before moving to graphic art, but would eventually participate in the company's brainstorming sessions, setting himself apart by sketching out storyboards of what the games would look like in action. It was at one of these sessions that Warlords made its debut within the company. As to where Warlords itself came from, Hector told Scott Stilphen in a 2013 interview that he was watching Charlie's Angels on TV in 1979 when he had the idea for a multiplayer take on Breakout. Sketching out his idea, this would feature brick walls in each corner of the screen and players defending these castles with paddles from bouncing balls. The last king standing within their castle would be the winner. Hector developed a storyboard for this game, drawing up a full-size storyboard of his concept under the title Kings in the Castle, and he showed it off at a brainstorming session. He heard nothing more about it until the arcade version first went out on field tests. Evidently, Hector's concept made its way to both the coin-op and consumer divisions. In a 2011 interview with Will Nicholes, Meninsky explained that she picked the project up off a list of potential VCS games, recalling it was dubbed the Kings in the Corner Breakout game. Realizing Hector's concept as a full playable game was her job, and she put together a bona fide hit, and likely Atari's best-selling quote-unquote original game for the VCS. The central conceit of Warlords is an interesting twist on the old ball and paddle genre. Here, each player is defending a fortress in one corner of the screen. There is a fireball that bounces around the arena, and anytime it hits a fortress wall, it knocks a piece out. The players can protect their walls by using a shield, which functions much like a paddle in Breakout or Pong. Hitting the fireball will knock it away in a direction based on the angle it connected with the shield, with the ball speeding up as it hits darker colored pieces of wall. Once the fireball has hit the king in the middle of a fortress, that player is out of the match. Whoever wins 5 matches first wins the game. The manual spins an odd tale about a King Frederick and a Queen Christina having 4 sons who grew up to be belligerent young men that fought amongst each other constantly. To protect his kingdom, Frederick banished these 4, Dominic, Marcus, Philippe, and Restivo, to a forbidden wasteland where they constructed forts and battled each other for centuries. The player, it maintains, is assuming their roles in part of this endless struggle for dominance. For options, Meninsky included a variety of game types that allowed players to adjust the speed of the ball and whether or not players can hold the ball with their shield to specifically aim at weak points. There's also a doubles mode where 2 players each control 2 of the corners in a 2-on-2 matchup. Much like Missile Command, Warlords also includes children's games, with extremely slow fireballs and no catch function. And crucially, Warlords also allows up to 4 players to compete at a time. Anything less than that, and the remainder will be operated by the computer. While the computer is an okay opponent in a pinch, it has some quirks that make it fairly inconsequential for experienced players. But multiplayer is where Warlords shines brighter than possibly anything else on the VCS. Alliances can form and be broken on the fly, and matches can quickly devolve into pure chaos once the ball gets going fast enough. And even players knocked out of the matches can still affect the outcome. While their shield may go dark, it's still able to deflect the ball if it connects, giving these ghost players a chance to get revenge. It's incredibly easy to get caught up in wanting to go again, and since the game uses the paddle, it's intuitive for new players to pick up and figure out. It's likely for these reasons that Warlords was picked up for an arcade release, too. Debuting in April 1981, the arcade version of Warlords was likely in development under the name Castle and Kings around the time Meninsky was finishing her console version up, a case of parallel development. And while Meninsky insists it was her, it's unclear who may have started first. The arcade game did manage to beat the VCS cartridge to market by mere months, though they're close enough in timing that the likeliest explanation is they both were working off of Hector's initial storyboard separately. Production timelines would suggest that this version was likely completed around the end of 1980, and while we don't know when the VCS version was finished, Atari had already started advertising it in January. Developed by Norm Avelair and Greg Rivera, the arcade version of the game maintains the core Warlords loop, but adds a few new bells and whistles that improve on the experience. Here, a dragon appears at the start of each round to spit out the fireball that starts things off, with new fireballs appearing over time. Catching and holding the ball will damage your own fortress as long as it's being held, giving an incentive for players to keep things moving. While there aren't any ghost shields here, the computer is a more dangerous opponent on the whole. Warlords arcade cabinet came in a 2-player upright form factor and has a 4-player cocktail table, and includes a clever 3-dimensional model that is reflected onto the screen as a way to get around the graphical limitations of the day. According to historian Keith Smith, Atari ended up selling around 2,200 Warlords units, split in half by format. While this qualifies as a pretty modest hit by Atari's standards at the time, the arcade version's constant availability in arcade compilations has successfully kept it in the public eye over the decades. The VCS version has likely never needed that boost. According to Jerome Domeret's internal sales list seen in Once Upon Atari, Warlords was the 7th best-selling VCS game, shipping out more than 930,000 copies in its first year. Based on all available numbers from this photo and the late 80s Atari Corp internal sales figures, Warlords likely ended up selling around 1.8 million copies overall. Only a few other games can claim those kinds of numbers on any console at the time, let alone ones not based on existing arcade hits. Unsurprisingly for such a top-selling cartridge, Warlords was well regarded at the time, though outside of strategy write-ups it's hard to find fulsome coverage. Warlords won the Archie Award for Best Pong Variant for its really new and different take on ball and paddle games, and was a runner-up for Best Competitive Game in the January 1982 edition of Video. These awards were repeated in the March 1982 issue of Electronic Games, which also gave the title an in-depth strategy write-up the following June on how to use the catch function most effectively, particularly against the computer. Warlords also seems to have been popular enough to inspire a few computer clones, such as War Kings, a color computer program for 2 players, or Lords of War for the Amiga, though Atari's console competitors appear to have given the concept a wider berth. As a minor aside, Warlords came out in North America around the same time that Atari seems to have started selling its first major revision of the VCS hardware, the CX2600A. While the console largely appears similar, the internal structure has been redesigned to consolidate the multiple boards of the original CX2600 units to a single circuit board. The 2 difficulty switches have been relocated to the back of the console as smaller nubs, and the cartridge port is a bit shallower and wider. These 4 switchers are likely the most common VCS units of all, being the workhorse design during the system's boom years, and based on newspaper advertising, they appear to have made their debut in the spring. While newspapers regularly use the same stock photo of a 6-switch CX2600, the ad copy sometimes denotes it's the revision being mentioned. Upon finishing Warlords, Meninsky started looking at other programs and began work on a home conversion of the arcade tank game Battlezone, but left partway through, and her version of Battlezone has never turned up, however far along it got. Atari enticed her back to work on a Mercedes garbage truck version of Dodgem as a freelancer, and convinced her to return full-time after only a few months away. Meninsky's next game in this series will be the impressive VCS conversion of Star Raiders, though that wouldn't be published for over a year from Warlords' debut. Unsurprisingly, Warlords has seen a few homebrew attempts over the years to try and improve on its formula. Perhaps the best known of these is Medieval Mayhem, which brings many of the arcade game's changes to the VCS with a bevy of options all its own, right down to the opening dragon named Scarlet by the author. It's hard to improve upon Meninsky's original, but Medieval Mayhem manages to make a good go at it. Much like its predecessor, the game is highly regarded with quite a few glowing reviews on the developer's website and on Atari Age, which sells it on cartridge. A 5200 conversion dubbed Castle Crisis focuses specifically on porting the arcade game to that console, using the analog controls to its advantage. And finally, there is War on the Bally Professional Arcade. Much like the 5200's Castle Crisis, War is focused on bringing the arcade game to a home console, and uses all 4 Bally arcade controller ports, and the controller's built-in paddles, to full effect here. All of these are fantastic takes on Warlords, and the core game remains a thrill with a full crew to play with you. These homebrew versions are great, but that's not to discount Meninsky's original. Warlords truly is one of the best multiplayer games of its day, and a genuine classic of the VCS library. It's outclassed by Medieval Mayhem, yes, but even with just one ball bouncing around, matches with 3 or 4 players at a time are exciting experiences. It's a simple enough concept that it's easy to pick up and quickly understand after only a round or 2, and as a result, Warlords holds up incredibly well, especially if you can get a set of paddle controllers and 3 other people together. Next time, we grab our buckets.